Hey guys, welcome back. I'm not sure, I can't remember, but this morning I stumbled upon a article about Dawn French. If you're not familiar with who Dawn French is, she's a British actress that is well known for sitcom star of French and Saunders and playing Geraldine in The Vicar Dibley, which I love The Vicar Dibley, and my husband's British, and so that's how I ended up watching that. And we will continue to watch it because I love that show. However, I'm a little disappointed in Dawn French, to be honest. You couldn't have a career like hers and be dumb. I consider her a fairly forward, thinking person, but on this subject, it doesn't seem to be so. She had said that JK Rowling is a good person and just made a mistake. And the thing is, she didn't just make a mistake. And then she went on the Happy podcast, and that conversation was more, it was more about how we can't make mistakes in the public eye. And that's not true at all. A lot of people have made a lot of mistakes in the public eye. It's how you deal with that mistake, the aftermath of that mistake. And the thing is, JK Rowling didn't make a mistake. She has a position that just isn't factual. And I do think it's a little, I don't know how to say this delicately or diplomatically, but I do think it's a little bit disingenuous on Dawn French's part that she honestly doesn't understand the entire situation.
But I remember once I did a podcast with somebody actually, who at the end of the podcast, she said to me something, I can't even remember exactly what it was about now, but it was something, and it was when we'd finished recording and we were talking about, I can't remember. We were talking about we were talking about JK Rowling, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this person said to me, no, we're not having any of that. We know we're not associated with that. And I went, oh, okay, because I know JK a bit. And I said, oh, okay, because she used this terminology and we're not doing that's unacceptable. I said, oh, I don't even know that term. What is that? And she went, you need to catch up, Dawn. You need to catch up. People can't be constantly teaching you how to be, because this is not okay, and you need to catch up.
And I think that's perfectly valid. That is valid, that you need to catch up, Dawn French, because we are in the age of technology and the age of information. We have so many resources at our fingertips. Go through JK Rowling's essay of it's so terrible. Like, there's a difference between having a difference in opinion and a difference in factual information. A lot of the things that JK Rowling has put in her essay are demonstrably false. They just are. They're not based on fact. They're based on fiction. And perhaps that's what she should stick with. Fiction, because she happens to be pretty good at that, but not facts. That doesn't seem to be her strong suit. That's just me being annoyed at JK Rowling for using her platform to put more trans people in harm, because that's exactly what she did. Now, I will say this up front. Anyone that sent her a death threat or any kind of threat of violence or sexual violence or anything like that, that is wrong. That should never, ever, ever be your response to anybody that you disagree with. I don't care what they said. I don't care what they said. That should never, ever, ever be the response we give another human being, because we do need to consider our humanness first, above everything else. I am human above being a woman, above being a white woman, above being an American, above being a progressive, above being anything else. I am human. That's it. I'm human. And we need to have a commonality that we treat other humans, regardless if we agree with them. I would never send a death threat to somebody that believes that Trump should be in office. I think it's terribly dangerous. If Trump gets in office, I think that's going to be detrimental to the entire country and by proxy, probably to the entire world, because we insert ourselves in so much of the world. Not that we're so important, but we have inserted ourselves in lots of the world. So that's why I think it would be detrimental. It irked the actor that was said to her.
And I left it all thinking, okay, do I need to catch up? Is that right? I do need to catch up, and that is true. But I also need to be taught. I need to learn.
And also, we can't know everything. There's loads of things. There's loads of moments where I go, oh, I don't know. And that's become another thing. It's almost like you're not allowed to say, I don't know anymore. I don't know about this subject.
I don't know.
We're not allowed to say it.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's very powerful to say that, especially when you don't know.
Yeah,
that's
completely.
better than pretending you do know.
Completely.
And it's certainly better than forming an opinion about something you don't know.
I know.
And I'm just saying, please, especially you younger folk, please inform me and explain this to me so that I can understand it and not make this mistake again. But don't tell me to catch up.
Which, that is fair. You can say I don't know. You can say I'm not familiar with something. But honestly, in today's day and age, you're not familiar with JK Rowling position on transgender people? Really? Where have you been? Have you been under a rock? She said this 2020, 4 years ago. French was on the Happy Podcast yesterday, or the day before. And I have a problem with that because she's putting the onus on younger people to educate her. That is not their job. It is no one's job to educate you, John French, than you. You are not only a celebrity, but you are rich. You are at least wealthy. I don't know how much you're worth, but I know you're worth more than me. I know you have the internet at your fingertips. You can hire someone to explain it to you. You don't need random young people to do that for you. And I think you can be a good person and do bad things. And I think you can be a bad person and do good things. It happens. And I really hate this thing about, well, she's a good person. She meant well. And I don't like how Dawn French went into that as well.
The most colourful voices are, which happened to be JK at a particular time, who made her mistakes, but who is also a very good person with a remarkable history of all kinds of things and has paid a huge price and whatever. We are people who know we make mistakes. We know, that we have shortcomings. We know all this stuff, but because we are expected to present ourselves as perfect,
yep,
and only celebrate all the perfect things, it's just wiped out any, as you say, any margin for error. I am a massive advocate of robust debate,
yep,
that might change your mind.
That's gone out the window too.
What? But that's the best thing in the world.
Correct, yeah.
That's how we govern, or should.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not how we govern anymore. But the whole point is, I sit here with you, you have a different opinion to me, you have a different experience to me, and by listening to you, and also knowing, and this is key, knowing that your intent is good. If I suspect your intent is not good, or there's another purpose to your intent, of course I'm going to be suspicious. And again, human beings operate on 1,000 sophisticated levels, so I'll be feeling a bit of that as you start telling me your opinions. I'll think, she's got another agenda. But if your intent is good, and we sit here and you tell me your other opinion or how you came to it, I'm going to understand that.
Yeah, and could still happily disagree. Lovely.
Could happily disagree, or could change my mind and agree. And that would be a win.
Regardless of your intent, it can still have a detrimental effect to a group of people you're talking about. Ask anybody that's in a group of very marginalized people, and they will probably tell you that it's damaging to them when you say the intent matters. Because people have said, I don't intend to be racist, but they were racist. Didn't intend to be sexist, but then they were sexist. I didn't mean to be misogynistic, but they were misogynistic. I read an article that led me back to JK Rowling's essay that she wrote back in June 10th of 2020. when did she do that tweet? It was before that, and I think it was in May or March or something like that in 2020. But she writes this essay, and as she is it, I do have a real big problem with how she goes about this, because factually it's incorrect in many places, and it's easy to debunk. Like, it took no time at all. I didn't have to search high and low to find things by credible sources that said, this isn't correct, and this is why this is not correct. This isn't an easy piece to write, for reasons that will shortly become clear. But I know it's time to explain myself on an issue surrounded by toxicity. I write this without any desire to add to that toxicity. But she did, in a big way. For people who don't know, last December, I tweeted my support for Maya Forstater, a tax specialist who lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. She took her case to an employment tribunal, asked the judge to rule on whether a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology is protected in law. Judge Taylor ruled that it wasn't. My interest in trans issues predates Maya's case by almost 2 years, during which I followed the debate around the concept of gender identity closely. I don't think she did. No. I think she's full of it. I met trans people and read sundry books, blogs, articles by trans people, gender specialists, intersex people, psychologists, safeguarding experts, social workers, and doctors, and followed the discourse online in traditional media. On one level, my interest of this issue has been professional, because I'm writing a crime series set in the present day, and my fictional female detective is of an age to be interested in, affected by these issues herself. But on another, it's intensely personal, as I'm about to explain. Because she goes on to make it about her. All the time I've been researching and learning, accusations and threats from trans activists have been bubbling in my Twitter timeline. This was initially triggered by a like. When I started taking an interest in gender identity and transgender matters, I began screenshotting comments that interested me as a way of reminding myself what I want to research later. On one occasion, I absentmindedly liked instead of screenshotting. That single like was deemed evidence of wrongthink, and a persistent low-level harassment began. Now, if that was the only mistake she made, we would not be here today. See, that's and she would not have wrote this essay. That is not why she's been attacked. Don't let that fool you, because that's not true. It may have started with a like, but it snowballed from there because of her and her actions. JK Rowling is the one that was rolling this snowball down the hill to make it bigger. And that'll be evident. Months later, I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, which I actually do agree with. If that's that person's position, that's not bigot. It's just not. Like, if you don't want to date, if you're a lesbian and you don't want to date a transgender woman with a penis, that makes sense to me, and probably to most people. I don't think that's really the problem here. But as I have learned, JK Rowling loves to cherry pick. So I have a feeling that was cherry picked just for her essay. Dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists, and the level of social media abuse increased. I mention all this to explain that I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when I supported Maya. I must have been on my 4th or 5th cancellation by then. Honestly, I don't even know why people are so bitter about cancellation. It's not cancellation. It's consequences. In the word. of cancellation, because that's what that is. Your actions have consequences. And when your actions have a huge, and if you're a public figure, yeah, is it harder for you to make a mistake? Of course it is, because you're a public figure. That means you have a greater responsibility to the world and to your audience. That is a great responsibility. Because if you take your platform and you use it for bad, which people have, there's consequences to that. And sometimes social consequences. Now, it should never be in the form of death threats or violence. Okay, I've already said that before. I'll say it again. But people criticizing you for it, that's fair. That's 100% fair. Then I expected the threats of violence to be told I was literally killing trans people with my hate, which isn't really far off, because she has such a huge platform and she can reach so many people. And those people can reach so many people. Like, it's a chain reaction. And it's funny because, I mean, chain reactions we don't tend to see. But when we do, it's terrible. And I think of Walter White in Breaking Bad. And this is going to be a spoiler. If you haven't watched it, I'm sorry, but this is a spoiler. This is not a new show. This has been out for a while. At some point, he lets his business partner's girlfriend choke to death on her own vomit. And he ends up seeing the impact of that. So she ends up dying. Now he's trying to basically control his partner, and it's awful. You can tell he feels awful for it, but it's still awful. And her dad is an air traffic controller. He ends up going back to work too soon. 2 planes collide due to him. Part of those planes crash over Walter White's house. So he sees that, dead bodies on his front lawn. And he ends up he works at a high school during this time as a science teacher or chemistry teacher. Well, that's science. But the students have all been affected by this. And they're all sad and not understanding how to deal with this. And he goes on a long rant about, it could be worse. Just terrible. But then things just keep happening. I think what goes through his head, he doesn't actually say this, but I think what would go through my head if I was Walter White, if I hadn't let that woman die, none of this would be happening right now. And he saw the ripple effect of his decision. I'm not saying JK Rowling actually killed anybody or allowed someone to die. But the thing is, when you advocate, especially in the UK where, United States too, but in the UK where they're not great on transgender issues, they really aren't. We're not either, but in certain parts of the country, we're way better than we are in other parts of our country. And I'm sure that's true about England as well. But I think England has a little bit far to go, but further to go than it, to kind of catch up. Like, the whole country needs to catch up, honestly. There are transgender affirming care and stuff like that. To be called a C word and a bitch, and of course, for my books to be burned, although one particular abusive man told me he'd compost them. What did I expect in the aftermath of my cancellation was the avalanche of emails and letters that came showering down upon me, an overwhelming majority of which were positive, grateful, and supportive. They came from a cross-section of kind, empathetic, and intelligent people, some of them working in fields dealing with gender dysphoria and trans people, who are all deeply concerned about the way a socio-political concept is influencing politics, medical practices, and safeguarding. They're worried about the dangers to young people, gay people, and about the erosion of women's and girls' rights. Above all, they're worried about the climate of fear that serves nobody, least of all trans youth well. Transgender people They're not the one eroding women's rights, women and girls' rights. They happen to be a lot of cis straight men that are doing that, at least in the United States. So if it was a mob of transgender people, they're like, you don't deserve rights, only we do. That would be weird, and I wouldn't support that. But I support transgender women and transgender men rights. They deserve it because they're people first. Regardless of what gender they identify with, regardless of what sex they were born as, regardless of what their hair color, eye color, skin color, religion, political belief system, we are human first. And that's what we need to start looking at each other as first. I stepped back from Twitter for many months before and after tweeting support for Maya because I knew I was doing nothing good for my mental health. I only returned because I wanted to share a free children's book during the pandemic. Immediately, activists who clearly believe themselves to be good, kind, and progressive people swarmed back into my timeline, assuming a right to police my speech, accused me of hatred, call me misogynistic slurs, and above all, as every woman involved in this debate will know, TERF. If you didn't already know, why should you? TERF is an acronym coined by trans activists, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. In practice, a huge and diverse cross-section of women are currently being called TERFs. Yeah, I don't think it's a huge amount of women. And the vast majority have never been radical feminists. That's a weird equivocation. Examples of so-called TERF range from mother of a gay child who was afraid their child wanted to transition to escape homophobia bullying, which makes zero sense because the amount of bullying that transgender people get is a lot worse than any homophobia would be. So yeah, you're not going to escape. You're going to go into the deep end of the bigotry pool if you become transgender, which is unfortunate. Hitherto, total unfeminist older lady who's vowed never to visit Marks and Spencer's again because they're allowing any man who says they identify as a woman into a woman changing room. Okay, they're not letting him into your changing room while you're in it. So I don't understand the problem. You're not going to be naked outside of your changing room, are you? Because you shouldn't. I wouldn't. I think that would be weird. I do not want to see your naked body outside of your room. I just don't, if I'm in public. I don't understand the problem with that. They include trans men in their feminism because they were born women. I include trans women in my feminism because they are women. But I support all transgender people, not just transgender women. I support non-binary trans people, binary trans people of both genders. But accusations of TERF or turfery have been sufficient to imitate many people, institutions and organizations I once admired who cowered before the tactics of the playground. They call us transphobic. They say, I hate trans people. What next? They'll say I've got fleas, speaking as a biological woman. Which, if you have to say that, really? You can't see the problem with that? It really depends on context. Sometimes it makes a difference to say, I'm a cis woman, But I feel like she's using it like I'm better than you because I'm biologically a woman. Anyway, speaking as a biological woman, a lot of people in positions of power really need to grow a pair, which is doubtless literally possible, according to the kind of people who argue that clownfish prove humans aren't dimorphic species. Okay, so why am I doing this? Why speak up? Why not quietly do my research and keep my head down? And no one's advocating for that. See, that's the thing, is that everyone's turning this into, oh, you need to just shut up and sit down. That's not it. The problem is not that she said something wrong. It's not that she made a mistake. It's the fact that she's buying into these things that aren't true. And then she's giving them legitimacy. So other people are just going to believe them because she does. Because guess what people don't like to do? Their own research. I mean, it's true. If everyone did their own due diligence, Trump would have zero supporters, except for, I'm sure he'd still have a very small group of people that are just, there's no saving some people, but most people I think are savable. Well, I've got 5 reasons for being worried about new trans activism and deciding I need to speak up. Here's where we get into the part that's untrue and unfounded. Firstly, I have a charitable trust that focuses on alleviating social deprivation in Scotland, in a particular emphasis on women and children. Amongst other things, my trust supports projects for female prisoners, for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. I also fund medical research into MS, which is multiple sclerosis, a disease that behaves very differently in men and women. It's become clear to me for a while the new trans activism is having, or likely to have, if all its demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support. How? Because it's pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replacing it with gender, which it's not. Because sex and gender aren't the same thing. They are different things. Sex is real, what you're born as. I was born female, my husband was born male, and sometimes people are born with both, which is rare, but it happens. Okay, so gender is a social construct, like money. While physical money is real, the importance and the value we put on money is in fact false. I mean, it's made up. We just made that up, right? This is our currency. This is what we're going to use to barter and trade. And we all decided on that as a society, right? So gender is not binary. It doesn't have to be. Gender is not male, female, always. It's also non-binary. It's also intersex. There's more than one gender. And I think some people have an issue with that. It's like, there's just more than one. Understand. There's more than 2. Understand. The thing is, it is not my place to tell another human being what's inside their mind. Because that is transgender, where the transgender issue arises. It's their mind. They believe they are born in the wrong body. And people are like, I don't believe you can be born in the wrong body. Really? You really think that? Because there's a ton of things that happen to fetuses in utero. That's why there are procedures to terminate certain pregnancies, because it would be cruel to both the mother and the baby to continue that pregnancy. The second reason is that I'm an ex-teacher and the founder of a children's charity, which gives me an interest in both education and safeguarding. Like many others, I have deep concerns about the effect the trans right movement is having on both. The third is that, as a much banned author, I'm interested in freedom of speech and have publicly defended it, even onto Donald Trump. I will also defend it to anyone. Everyone has a freedom of speech in the respective countries that allow that, because not all countries allow that. Pushing back on what someone said isn't limiting their freedom of speech. It's the consequences of that freedom of speech. I say things on here on YouTube, and someone has every right to come and criticize what I'm saying. But the thing is, what I'm saying is backed up by facts, not by fiction. So, unlike JK Rowling, and unlike many people who like to criticize people on the internet. The fourth is where things start getting truly personal. I'm concerned about the huge explosion in young women wishing to transition, and also about the increasing numbers who seem to be detransitioning, returning to their original sex, because they regret taking steps that have, in some cases, altered their bodies irrevocably and taken away their fertility. Some say they decide to transition after realizing they were same-sex attracted and that transitioning was partly driven by homophobia, either in society or in their families. I'd argue, so this is full of inaccuracy. So I went and I found, so she says, I'm concerned about the huge explosion in young women wishing to transition. Now, one, it could be just because it's more accepted now that they feel like they can do it. Now, transgender people aren't new. They've been around since the Romans. Now we're going to talk about how many actually regret it. So I'm reading from an AP article that was dated on March 5th, 2023 by Lindsay Tanner. And it is called How Common is Transgender Treatment Regret? Detransitioning. Okay, an updated treatment guidelines issued last year, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health said evidence of a later regret is scant. Scant means small, but that patients should be told about the possibility during a psychological counseling. And I agree with that. I agree. You should tell people that there are some people that do regret this decision. And, because everyone should have all the information going into a decision so that person can make the best educated decision for themselves at the time. Now, should we have robust things in place, especially in the psychological aspect of this? But to try to safeguard that as much as possible without denying access to people because a small amount might regret it. So, some studies suggest that rates of regret have declined over the years as patient selection and treatment methods have improved. Now, yes, some of the people that regretted a transition didn't regret the actual transition. They regretted the side effects that came with that transition because the medical treatment for it was not great. In review of 27 studies involving almost 8,000 teens and adults who had transgender surgeries, mostly in Europe and the US and Canada, 1% on average expressed regret. 1%. For some, regret was temporary, but a small number went on to have a detransitioning or reversal surgeries, the 2021 review said. Research suggests that comprehensive psychological counseling before starting treatment, along with family support, can reduce the chances of regret and detransitioning. I also have a theory for the detransitioning of people that because transgender people get so much hate, that the reason why they transition back is because it's so hard to live as a transgender person, not because of being transgender, because of society, because we as society don't let people live the way they want. And also, if you don't have the support of your family, that may not determine whether or not you regret it, but it could be a factor. So if you have all the necessary treatment and you have all the necessary support, do those people ever? I'd be interested to understand why those 1% of people detransitioned. Most people probably aren't aware. I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly. She didn't. That 10 years ago, a majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. The ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred to transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in the numbers. Are they though? So this is a article from The Guardian. It is dated November 24th, 2022, and it was written by Amelia Gentleman. Okay, so, and the headline for this, an explosion. What is behind the rise in girls questioning their gender identity? An explosion in referrals. The rise in the number of biological girls seeking referrals and GIDs was set out in an interim report by Dr. Hilary Cass, the pediatrician commissioned to conduct a review of the services provided by the NHS to children and young people questioning their gender identity. The trend confirmed by clinicians who spoke with The Guardian. In the past few years, it has become an explosion. Many of us feel confused by what has happened. It's often hard to talk about colleagues, and London-based psychiatrist worked in a child-adolescent mental health unit who has been a consultant in the past 17 years. Like all NHS employees interviewed, she asked for anonymity due to sensitivity of the subject. I might have seen one child with gender dysphoria once every 2 years when I started practicing. It's very niche and rare. Now somewhere between 10 and 20% of caseloads is made up of adolescents registered as female at birth who identify as non-binary trans, with just an occasional male registered teenager who identifies as trans. Another senior child psychologist said girls who wanted to transition made up about 5% of her caseload. And it does go on to say other things, but I want to get down to the part that talks about left-handedness, because this is a very good point. Greater awareness of trans issues is likely to be the common sense explanation for the rise in frequent referrals, which I agree. Left-handedness increased over time after we stopped punishing left-handed children in schools, because some children are naturally left-handed and we're now able to express it, said Cleo Madeline, who's a spokesperson for the trans support group and gendered intelligence. In the same way, increased visibility and acceptance of trans people has led to a gradual increase in young people who feel comfortable expressing their trans identity. The most important thing is to recognize that this is not a problem to be solved or a bad outcome to be avoided, which I wholeheartedly agree. We don't need to solve the transgender problem. We need to solve the non-acceptance of transgender people, because that's the problem. We don't need to avoid transgender people or avoid our children becoming transgender. What we need to do is not look at it as a bad outcome. If we look at it as all right, it's going to be a good outcome because that's what you want. And even if there are some people that regret their decision, that is not a good case to make it illegal or hard for everybody else, for the 99% that aren't going to regret it. It's like the abortion stance. Majority of the people who are asking for abortion to be banned outright, most of the women that are fighting for that had an abortion that they regretted. That sucks, but that's their problem. Just because some people regret it doesn't mean all people are going to regret it. And it doesn't even mean a significant amount of people are regretting it. The same phenomenon has been seen in the U.S. in 2018. American physician and researcher Lisa Littman set out to explore it. In an interview, she said, parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors. Littman mentioned Tumblr, Reddit, Instagram, and YouTube as contributing factors to rapid onset gender dysphoria, where she believes that in the realm of transgender identification, youth have created particular insular echo chambers. Yeah, except that was all debunked. So, AAP Publications, Pediatrics, Volume 150, Issue 3, September of 2022, Sex Assigned at Birth, Ratio Amongst Transgender and Gender Diverse Adolescents in United States. The objective was representatives of some pediatric gender clinics have reported an increase in transgender and gender diverse adolescents presenting for care who were assigned female at birth, AFAB, relative to those assigned to male at birth, AMAB. This data has been used to suggest that youth come to identify as transgender or gender diverse because of social contagion, with the underlying assumption that AFAB youth are uniquely vulnerable to this hypothesis phenomenon. hypothesized phenomenon. Reported changes in the AMAB-AFAB ratio have been cited in recent legislative debates regarding the criminalization of gender-affirming medical care. Our objective was to examine the AMAB-AFAB ratio among United States transgender diverse adolescents in larger and more representative sample than the past clinic recruited samples. Methods. Using the 2017 and 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey across 16 states that collected gender identity data, we collected the AMAB and AFAB ratio for each year. We also examined the rates of bullying, victimization, and unaliving amongst this group youth compared to cisgender peers. Results. The analysis include 91,937 adolescents in 2017 and 105,437 adolescents in 2019. In 2017, 2,161, 2.4% participants identified as trans or gender diverse, with a AMAB-AFAB ratio of 1.5 to 1. In 2019, 1,640, 1.6% of participants identified as TGD, with AMAB and AFAB ratio of 1.2 to 1. Rates of bullying, victimization, and unaliving were higher amongst the TGD group youth when compared with their cisgender peers. Conclusion. The sex assigned at birth ratio of TGD adolescents in the United States does not appear to favor AFAB adolescents and should not be used to argue against the provision of gender-affirming medical care for trans or gender diverse adolescents. You can read the whole study if you want. It is very interesting. Not to mention, there's a bunch of people from Harry Potter that have come out against JK Rowling in this assertion. Oh yeah, this is Elisa Littman, where she had the hypothesis of, so researchers used data from 2017 to 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey to explore the hypothesis known as rapid onset gender dysphoria, which posits that young people begin to identify as TGD for the first time as adolescents rather than as pre-pubertal children. Pre-pubertal, that's a hard word. Prepubescent children, and its identification and subsequent gender dysphoria are the result of social contagion. The ROGD hypothesis further asserts that youth assigned female sex at birth are more susceptible to social contagion than those assigned to male sex at birth. In a sex assigned at birth ratio amongst transgender and gender diverse adolescents in the United States, researchers examined data reported, the same study I was just talking about. The total percentage of TGG adolescents decreased from 2.4 in 2017 to 1.6 in 2019. This decrease in the overall percentage of adolescents identifying as TGD is incongruent with ROGD hypothesis. Between 2017 and 2019, the sex assigned at birth ratio TGD adolescents shifted towards more adolescents assigned at female at birth, which would initially appear to support the ROGD hypothesis. In 2017, the ratio of those assigned male at birth compared to those assigned female at birth was 1.47 to 1. In 2019, the ratio of those assigned male at birth compared to assigned female at birth was 1.16 to 1. However, the shift in sex ratio was driven by a decrease in the proportion of those assigned male at birth openly identifying as TGD, which further undermines the ROGD hypothesis. The percentage of adolescents assigned female at birth decreased from 2017 to 2019. The RODG hypothesis asserts that youth are drawn to come out as TGD to avoid the stigma associated with being a sexual minority, or because of being TGD would make them more popular amongst their peers. Yet rates of bullying, victimization, and unaliving were higher amongst TGD youth as compared with their cisgender peers, including their cisgender sexually minority peers. Both findings are incongruent with the notion that some youth openly identify as TGD in an attempt to flee the stigma of being a sexual minority, or because being TGD will make them more popular amongst their peers. That's sus, right? Of course they're not doing that. The ROGD hypothesis, first published in 2018, immediately gained influence in public policy debates with coverage by publications ranging from The Economist to Science. This past June, Florida's Agency for Healthcare Administration referred to reports citing the ROGD hypothesis as justification for a new policy implemented this past June, prohibiting the use of Medicaid funds for gender-affirming healthcare. In July, the popular children's book author JK Rowling tweeted to over her 13 million followers that gender-affirming healthcare harms adolescents. And it doesn't. Actually, it has proven to help them because it lowers their depression, it lowers their unaliving rates, and that, my friends, is a win. Yet, the 2018 study popularizing the ROGD hypothesis was based on surveys completed by 256 parents with no input from TGD youth. Parents were recruited from 3 websites, 2 of which were anti-transgender. So can we say confirmation bias? One, Fourth Wave Now, describes itself as a community of people who question the medicalization of gender atypical youth. The tagline for the second site, Gender Trend, is "No child is born in the wrong body." The idea that attempts to flee sexual minority stigma drive teenagers to come out as transgender is absurd, especially to those of us who provide treatment to TGD youth, said study lead author Dr. Jack Turbin, incoming assistant professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. The damaging effects of these unfounded hypotheses and further stigmatizing transgender and gender diverse youth cannot be understated. We hope that clinicians, policymakers, journalists, and anyone else who contributed to health policies will review these findings. Anyway, so Rowling goes on to say that the doctor's paper. She was accused of bias and spreading misinformation about transgender people, because she was subjected to a tsunami of abuse and concerted campaign to discredit both her and her work. Well, if a doctor is saying the wrong things in public and saying, hey, this is a phenomenon that's happening, but it's not, because it's based on 256 parents and 2 of the sites are anti-transgender. What did you think was going to be your findings? Because that's pretty biased in my opinion. The journal took the paper offline and re-reviewed it before republishing it. However, her career took a similar hit that suffered by Maya Forstater. Lisa Littman had dared challenge one of the central tenets of trans activism. No, that's not what happened. She literally gathered information, I should say, that confirmed her own bias, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. Nobody, the activist insisted, could ever be persuaded into being trans. Yeah, I don't think anybody could. The argument of many current trans activists is that if you don't let transgender dysphoric teenagers transition, they will unalive themselves, because that's what was happening before. And those rates went way down as soon as people were allowing those children to have puberty blockers. to have, the support system and the psychiatry that they need. And then she goes on to make it about her, JK Rowling. She goes on to say, oh, had I been born maybe 30 years later, I may have been persuaded to become transgender. You're not persuaded. Is a PubMed, National Library of Medicine, NIH, and we go down to unaliving related outcomes following gender affirming treatment, a review. This is the abstract. Gender affirming treatment remains a topic of controversy. A particular concern is whether gender affirming treatments reduces unaliving. A narrative review was undertaken evaluating unaliving related outcomes following gender-affirming surgery, hormones, and or puberty blockers. Of the 23 studies that met the inclusion criteria, the majority indicated a reduction in unaliving following gender-affirming treatment. However, the literature to date suffers from a lack of methodologic rigor that increases the risk of type 1 error. There is a need for continued research, which I agree, unaliving outcomes following gender-affirming treatment that adequately controls for the presence of psychiatric comorbidity, treatment, substance use, and other unaliving risk-enhancing limitations. There is also a need for future systemic review given the inherent limitations of a narrative review. There have been implications in the informed consent process of gender-affirming treatment, given the current lack of methodological robustness of literature reviewed. But for our best understanding, and that is congruent with a lot of people that I've seen online, met in person, and had talked to about this, and yeah, there's a lot of people who, before they come out, before they get into any care, they do feel like they don't want to be alive anymore because it's so hard. But JK Rowling goes on to make it about herself and about how she, then she goes on to talk about her own abuse. And it's like, but your abuse has nothing to do with this. Your trauma has nothing to do with transgender people. Nothing at all. So take your trauma and put it somewhere else because this is not the space for it. And she keeps advocating for spaces where it's only one sex. That it is possible for a woman to abuse another woman, right? Via abuse, violence, or sexually. It happens. So saying I only want to be around cis women because I don't want to be around anyone that was male at birth because it interferes with my safety is ridiculous and preposterous. I've been abused and I have no problem with transgender women. I have been in bathrooms with transgender women, and guess what they don't do? I'm sure it's happened somewhere, but you know what? Just because one or two people, there's a handful of people that may have done something bad, shouldn't kill it for everyone else. I'm more than happy to share my bathroom or anything else with a transgender woman, because guess what? I'm not threatened by her. I'm not threatened by her in any way, shape, or form at all. So one thing I do think is particularly gross about her essay is this unfounded information that I was not able to fact check at all. Like, it just doesn't exist, this information. So I don't know where she got it, but she didn't list any sources, so she couldn't be fact checked. Okay, so I want to be very clear here. I know transition will be the solution for some gender dysphoric people. No, for most. Although I'm also aware that those extensive research and studies have consistently shown that between 60 and 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria. But then there's studies saying that that's not true. So transgender kids tend to maintain their identities as they grow up, studies suggest. Apparently she didn't consult this study. So this was published on May 4th, 2022. Now this is after her thing, of course. Had she still clings to this as her position. She hasn't like said, you know what, I was wrong. I've done more research, I was wrong. Because honestly, she said that at this point, I'd be okay with that. Because you know what? We all have shit that we've done wrong. I've had lots of views that were wrong that I have since changed, realized that I was wrong. And I was like, okay, I can do better because now I know better. The thing is, there's a lot more information now, 4 years after she wrote that, than there was then. So, okay, that's fair. She needs to re-up on that research because that research isn't going to be static. So children who began identifying as transgender at a young age tend to retain that identity for at least several years, a study published Wednesday suggests. The research involved 317 youngsters who were 3 to 12 years old when they were recruited to the study. 5 years later, at the study's end, 94% were living as transgender, and almost 2/3 were using their puberty blocking medication or sex hormones to medically transition. Most children in the study were from white, high-income families who supported their transitions. On average, the kids began identifying as transgender about age 6. Because gender has no bearing on your sexuality. So I hate that argument as well. People will be like, oh, well, you're 6 years old. You don't know sexuality. Well, sexual orientation is different from gender, and we need to make that very separate because that's not the same thing. A 6-year-old can say, I feel like a boy. And maybe they'll grow out of it. But I think you should humor them, support them. Because I think the people who, I think if you get some real big resistance from a parent, you might go backwards. And it's not because you grew out of it. It's because you decided the love of your family was more important than your happiness. And that's disgusting. I think puberty blockers are okay. But of course, you shouldn't have any surgeries until you're an adult. Christina Olson, a Princeton University psychologist who led the study, said a few of the children transitioned back briefly during the study, but by the end, most had returned to a transgender identity. And I wonder if they transitioned back because of pressure from other people, being bullied, being harassed, being victimized in some way, and then decided, no, I'm just going to be me. You know what I mean? It suggests that our model of thinking about people as they are either X or Y, they're either cisgender or transgender, is kind of an antiquated way of thinking about gender. And I agree, Olson said. She noted that when the study began in 2013, non-binary wasn't a common term, and the children studied used male and female pronouns. What that may change as the researchers follow them through their teen years. The youngsters were about 12 years on average when the study ended. The Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine and nonprofit group of health professionals who are concerned about medical transition risks for minors said the evidence shows high numbers of kids outgrow transgender identities by puberty or adulthood. Some researchers point to flaws in that data. Dr. William Malone, an advisor to the group, said that the new study appears to reinforce concerns that early societal gender transition may cement a young person's transgender identity and lead minors to the path that eventual medicalization with all its inherent risks and uncertainties. And then there's the AAP Publications Pediatrics, where the results are, we found that on average of 5 years after their initial social transition, 7.3% of youth had retransitioned at least once. At the end of this period, most youth identified as binary transgender youth, 94%, including 1.3 who retransitioned to another identity before returning to their binary transgender identity. A total of 2.5% of youth identified as cisgender and 3.5 as non-binary. Later, cisgender identities were more common amongst youth whose initial societal transition occurred before the age of 6. Their retransitions often occurred before the age of 10 years. Conclusion. These results suggest that retransitions are infrequent. Most commonly, transgender youth who socially transition at early ages continue to identify that way. Nonetheless, understanding retransitions is critical for clinicians and families to help make retransitions as smooth as possible for youth. And I agree with that. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think we need to look at people first and then anything else. And the thing is, it doesn't matter what you identify as. You are valid, you are loved, and you are not wrong. Anyway, I hope this was enlightening, and yeah, I wish JK Rowling would go through her own essay and fact check it, because it's not factual. And the last thing I want to say from this JK Rowling dumpster fire that she wrote is the very last sentence or paragraph or whatever. All I'm asking, all I want, is for similar empathy, similar understanding to be extended to the many millions of women whose sole crime is wanting their concerns to be heard without receiving threats and abuse. Now, you're right, they should be able to voice their opinions without threats and abuse. However, they are going to get backlash because it's unfounded opinions that are based on unfounded ideas. You can have an opinion about anything, but honestly, if you're going to give your opinion in a public space, you better research that shit. You better research the shit out of that shit. And I do not believe for 1 second that JK Rowling actually researched it. I think she went on a crusade for confirmation bias. That's my 2 cents, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you, and goodbye, and subscribe if you're new.